going back at least 10 years for this one, but it's something I still think about almost every dang day. It was the holiday season, incredibly cold out, and I was walking down the 40th Street, Lowry Street subway station near Queens Boulevard. I can't remember exactly where I was going at the time. I think I was on my way home from work, but I'm not sure if I actually worked a shift or if I just stopped by to pick up in advance, but either way, I'm basically in a world of my own, mulling over my financial troubles as I push through the ticket barrier and find a place to sit. Then, some person gets my attention, but only in that New York way where you don't ever look directly at the thing, you just observe it carefully out of your peripheral vision. This young-looking Latina lady, wearing a blue, white, and gray jacket, was pacing up and down the platform and, muttering to herself. It sounds cynical, I know, but when you grow up in NYC, you learn to live with stuff like that. You learn to just shrug it off and say, "It's none of my business," before moving on. But sometimes you don't get to just look away and pretend it isn't happening because that craziness, those damaged people, they make it your business. So like I said, the Hispanic girl is walking up and down, occasionally sitting down and then getting up again all erratically, and all the while, all the other passengers are just pretending like it's not happening. And then we hear the telltale sign of a train coming down the tunnel. So, just like usual, all the people taking it gradually stand up and make their way towards the edge of the platform. I remember seeing this one dude. He was some older-looking guy, and he's just minding his own business, waiting for the train to roll up. Then, out of nowhere, the girl basically runs up behind the guy and shoves him onto the tracks. The sound the crowd made is something that'll definitely stick with me for the rest of my life. You don't forget real terror like that when you hear it. But the messed up thing is, although they were screaming, no one actually did anything to help. I even remember seeing this flashing light and realizing that some dude was literally just standing there, taking pictures of the guy lying on the tracks as the train got louder and louder, and it got closer and closer. And then, as the screams reached this unbearable peak of horror, the train just rolled over the dude. I remember looking around and seeing the girl that had pushed him bolting up the stairs, trying to get as far away from the scene as she could. People were still screaming, only now some were crying while others followed the pusher up the stairs to either chase her or rushing the payphones to call 911. It all happened so fast I realized that all I'd done is just stand there, open-mouthed, just horrified by the whole thing. And for the longest time I kicked myself for not trying to help the guy. But more than one person has informed me that if I had jumped down to try to help the dude, I probably wouldn't be around to write this. I know the pusher was caught, as I followed the story for a while after, but I can't remember if they were charged with murder or just ended up getting locked up in Bellevue or something, because as sure as eggs is eggs, that girl was Ubats. Taking the subway got real stressful for a long time after, but thankfully, a lot of people were just as scared as I was, and I didn't have to suffer through the anxiety of watching people go too near the edge. They made sure not to all their own. Time went by and hysteria about subway pushers kind of faded, but every so often it still happens. In fact, it happened again just last month. Again, it was a woman from Queens that was arrested. Apparently, she never spoke to the guy she pushed, just picked someone at random and almost killed the guy. Hearing about other pushers just brings all that fear right back to me. One minute you're standing there minding your own business, just waiting for the frickin' subway, and the next, there's nothing. Life can end that suddenly, all because some psycho decided you had to die. Some psycho you never met before in your life. The fact that people out there exist, and there are a lot of them, that's the thing that scares me the most in the world, and why I never get up for a train before it comes to a complete stop. I used to work the stand-up circuit in Boston, and let me tell you, that was a wild time to be a comedian. And when you were like me and chose to get the T everywhere, it was even wilder. For those of you that don't know, the T is just what we call the subway in Beantown. And although it might not have the same nationally terrible reputation as New York's subway, I can assure you it used to be just as tough. Now, this happened way back when phones were just starting to get video recording technology, and being something of a gadget freak, I paid out the butt to be one of the first to own one. So, one night I'm coming back from a show just playing with my new phone when some girl gets out of the train and sits down opposite me. We make this tiny bit of eye contact, nothing confrontational, and as the train gets moving again, I carry on wasting time with my new toy. I'm going through some photos I'd taken at a show I'd done recently, and I remember I was smiling, in a real good mood when I suddenly hear, "Are you recording me?" I look up, and it's the girl. Some ratchet South Boston girl who looked like she hadn't slept in a year. She's got this look on her face that looked like a Rottweiler chewing a wasp, and when I'm like, "Who, you?" she screeches, "Yeah, me. You better not be recording me with that thing." I couldn't resist. I was like, why would I make a video of you? I leave prettier things in the toilet every morning. Not the smartest move, to just antagonize her like that, but hey, it's what I do for a living, and I was very much still in work mode. The retort seemed to do the trick for a minute, and the girl shut her mouth for a while and left me in peace. Then a minute later, she starts up again. "Oh, you think you're wicked smart, huh? You think you're hot stuff." I was only 2 stops away from home, so I decided to toy with her a little, nothing too harsh, just enough to pass the time until I could get off. Then, right as I'm getting off, I actually wish her a good night. I'd actually enjoyed our little back and forth, whereas she still looked incredibly mad. I didn't think she'd do what she did, though. I know she was mean, but I didn't think she was crazy. So I'm standing, waiting for the doors to open, and when they do, I instantly feel this real sharp pain right around my butt. I instantly kind of throw myself off the train while spinning around to see what in God's name just happened. There's Ratchet, this big smile on her face, and she's holding a needle in her hand. Jesus Christ. That girl had real summer teeth, you know. Some are here, some are there. All the hallmarks of a hardcore junkie. And as the doors started to close behind us, she just started laughing. Turns out she got me a good few times in the butt cheek with that needle, and although it only hurt a little for the next few days, my big fear was that I'd gotten some kind of junkie disease like Hep C or HIV or something. It's kind of a war story I tell these days, but just typing it up like this reminds me of how scared I was. I went straight to the hospital and got checked out, but after taking some blood samples, they told me I'd have to wait a few days to find out the results. Longest days of my life. I took those days off because there was no way I could still be funny with all of that on my mind. But thankfully it all came back clean. It'd hurt to sit down for a few days, but other than that, I'd be fine. I actually turned the whole thing into a stand-up bit a few years later, and I suppose that's just my way of dealing with things. But even though I can tell the story these days with a smile on my face, and in a way that can make people at least giggle a little bit, that doesn't change the fact that it was one of the scariest things that ever happened to me. At the time I thought my smart mouth almost cost me my life, in one of the most nightmarish ways to die imaginable. I grew up an avid urbex enthusiast here in New York City. As you can imagine, there are awesome sights here, but weirdly, I'd say more than 50% of the community agree that one of the urbex holy grails is over in Cincinnati. Yep, while Cincinnati is famous for that weird Greek chili or their OG baseball team, among the urbex crowd it's famous for one thing: the Cincinnati subway. For those of you that don't know, the subway was intended as a replacement for the Cincinnati streetcar system. Construction started around the end of World War I, but then after the Great Depression hit, the project just tanked. What remains is just over 2 miles of derelict tunnels and stations, making it the largest abandoned subway system in the United States. Cracking the place is like an urbex rite of passage, giving you infinite bragging rights having explored a labyrinth of subterranean tunnels that's larger than some towns. I thought my visit to the subway would be a dream come true. Me and my group planned it for months, and I don't think I've ever been so excited about anything. But in reality, it turned out to be one of the most confusing and terrifying experiences of my life, something I'll never be able to fully explain. As I said, it took quite a bit of planning to get the 4 of us out to southwestern Ohio. On top of barely being able to afford the gas money, we had to drive my friend's trashy 1990 Chevy Lumina, which was in such a bad way that it had become a meme of itself. It took almost 12 hours to get to Cincinnati. That's including a bathroom break, so even after leaving at like 9 a.m., the very earliest we could muster everyone, it was way after dark by the time we arrived. We were tired, starving, and in no mood to head underground right away, so after a brief discussion, we decided to get a few hours sleep before heading down into the subway. This turned out to be a terrible idea. We barely got any sleep, so after a few hours we decided to just get some breakfast at a 24/7 McDonald's, then hit up the subway while we could still use the darkness for cover. The entrance to the tunnels, at least the one we used, turned out to be right in plain sight. It was just sat at the side of a highway, clear as day, and although the big gray iron doors were incredibly heavy, they proved to be unlocked. And just like that, we were in. Then, one of us switched on their flashlight, and for a second, I was kind of taken aback. The concrete walls inside the entrance were completely bare, not a single tag or piece of graffiti art anywhere. One of the best parts of urbex is occasionally stumbling across what amounts to a secret gallery. So, to come across a place with no art where I expected at most was kind of disappointing. It didn't set alarm bells ringing or whatever, it was just unusual. Anyway, we excitedly started advancing down the entrance tunnel and find that it branched off into 2 twin tunnels that ran side by side. Then, after a few minutes of walking, the tunnels opened up into our first abandoned station. You can imagine what this looked like. Wide platforms with support columns, staircases that led to nowhere. It was a pretty cool find, and it was there that we found our first piece of street art. Only, instead of being something to admire, I remember finding it distinctly intimidating. Someone had sprayed a huge black figure onto the whole length of one wall, with its head and shoulders kind of overflowing onto the ceiling. The perspective made it look like it was staring down at you, and it definitely made for an intelligent and decidedly creepy piece of artwork. The logistics of it were downright impressive too. The walls had to be at least 15 foot high at the platform level, meaning someone had probably hauled a ladder down there with him at some point just to spray that blank-faced Yeti-looking thing on the wall. After we were suitably unnerved by the big dark figure, we carried on through the rail tunnels, hitting up station after station as we went. Each one had a series of smaller tunnels leading off from them. Some were just a handful of dead ends. Others seemed to snake off into the darkness for quite a way. But the last station we got to, or at least that I got to, had a ton of different passages leading off from it. I'm guessing we were around the center of the subway system by that point because I read that they'd planned to dig out the central terminal station first, then tunnel outwards so everything fit to scale. And given that there seemed to be a tunnel, passageway, or corridor at every compass point, I'm guessing we were in that terminal station. Despite the creepy street art, we're getting pretty comfortable by that point. The first 10 to 15 minutes after you crack an old abandoned building can be a real adrenaline rush, and if there are hazards to be aware of, your heart stays pounding almost the whole way through. By that time, our count was in the high 50s, and I go so far as to say that we were pretty experienced. But that experience brings comfort, and getting too comfortable makes you sloppy. Add on to that a bad night's sleep and the sugar crash from having gorged under the golden arches, and for me personally, it was a recipe for disaster. It's not a strict life or death rule, but generally speaking, you don't split up when exploring an abandoned building. Sure, you can head off into an adjacent room, dip slightly out of sight for a second, but you don't go off wandering on your own, not unless you're very, very confident of your surroundings. You hear horror stories about gas sinks where someone walks into a room and just passes out and dies, all totally silently. Then one by one, their friends follow them into the room, only to join them in death. Little tidbits like that serve as great warnings, but gas sinks are an extremely rare phenomenon that you only get when you're really deep underground. So despite the potential for danger, I think I just switched off a few seconds and wandered down a passageway on my own. It was dumb, I know, but I swear I didn't walk too far, and I remember the feeling of confusion when I turned around and walked back down the corridor, only to find that it didn't open back up into the abandoned station. I stopped and paused for a second, feeling this momentary sense of bewilderment wash over me before I took a deep breath and gathered my thoughts. My crew had to be at the end of the corridor I was looking at. It was only logical. But when I walked down it, still using my flashlight to cut through the darkness, and there was still no station, I'll admit that I started to panic a little. My voice echoes as I called out down the corridor, hoping my friends might be able to hear me. When they didn't respond, I did what anyone else might do, just went straight into denial. I called out sarcastically, "Very funny, guys. You can come out now." But no one replied. Then I tried to stop myself from walking down another corridor, but in that brief little moment of panic, I just couldn't help myself. It didn't make sense. I knew how to follow my own footsteps. I'd done it 1,000 times before. But there I was, 50-something derps under my belt, and I'd actually gone and gotten myself lost. I just put it down to how tired I was and how dark the subway was, then reached in my backpack to retrieve my walkie-talkie. We always pack these small things, but powerful radios just in case. We never really had to use them before, but there's a first time for everything, right? So, I got the radio out, switched it on, then began talking on the agreed-upon Channel 1. Our little pre-agreed protocol was that as soon as someone gets separated, out come the radios. The guys must have figured I was missing by that point, so they must have had their radios out, or at least one of them. But when I talked onto the channel and got nothing in reply, I went back to thinking that they were just playing a prank on me. Then suddenly, my radio buzzes to life with an incoming transmission. It sounded kind of distorted, but that didn't surprise me given that we were surrounded by masses of concrete. But as I'm straining my ears to listen to voices in the static, I realize it's not any of my buddies' voices. In fact, it sounded a lot more like a woman. It was slightly accented, a feminine voice, but I could only make out every fourth or fifth word. Everything else was just garbled. Yet as I strained my ears and concentrated, I heard the voice repeating something that sounded an awful lot like, "Help me." That was the first time I'd ever come to a full-on panic while in an abandoned building, and I had to actually make an effort to control my breathing and keep calm. I told myself that the "help me" I thought I heard could have been almost any two-syllable phrase, and rationally speaking, the subway was a limited space. Even if I'd managed to get myself lost, there was no way I could stay lost if I just kept moving. So, that's exactly what I did. I switched on my little headlamp, told myself everything was going to be fine, then just walked off into the darkness. My main goal was to find the station we'd been standing in. That way I could effectively retrace my steps and find my way out of the subway system. But I walked and walked for maybe 15 to 20 minutes, and the whole time I failed to find an abandoned station, or even any of the twin railway tunnels we'd used to get into the place. It was just corridor after corridor, some of which forked off into 2 or 3 other passageways, and no matter which one I took, I'd never seemed to make any progress. I knew I could walk a mile in around 15 minutes, which meant that I could walk the entire length of the subway system in around 30 to 40. So when I clocked 45 minutes of walking, and I still hadn't found an exit, I felt myself getting that feeling of panic rising up into my chest again. It just didn't make any sense. The whole way I'd been talking to my radio, trying to raise my buddies, but to no avail. They had to be in range. Those radios were some of the most expensive things we owned, and the only reasonable explanation is the concrete was just too thick for the radio waves to penetrate. But still, even with a semi-rational explanation like that, I found one distinct thought creeping into my head. Something is very, very wrong here. Either something was wrong with me, or something was wrong with the tunnels, and being a somewhat rational person, I went with the first theory. I remember having to turn back when I wound up hitting a dead end, but after a few hundred feet, I realized I was walking a different layout of corridors than I had previously. Some of them had these cuboid concrete bumps in them, like they were the foundations for some kind of barrier. But then I started seeing them on the ceiling too, these 3D rectangles that looked like they'd been chiseled out of the rock. I hadn't seen those things walking down the corridor the first time, at least. I hadn't noticed them, but then my suspicions were confirmed when I noticed that the concrete ahead of me was all wet, something which definitely hadn't been the case a few minutes before. That little detail did really bother me, way worse than losing my buddies too. As you can probably guess, underground tunnels and water leaks are a very bad combination, and the discovery added an even graver sense of danger to the situation. After I noticed the water, my pace increased significantly as I tried my best to keep calm, but the further I went, the harder that got. The sound of my wet footsteps had me praying I wasn't heading towards the source of the leak, and that I wasn't about to get hit by some underground tsunami or something. Not the most rational fear, I know, but like I said, I was struggling to remain calm. But then, right as the tension was really ramping up, I could have sworn that I'd heard a second set of wet footsteps in the tunnel behind me. I remember stopping dead in my tracks and listening, but the sound didn't continue, so I figured it was just an echo of my own footsteps. Yet shortly after continuing on my way, I heard a footstep behind me that was most definitely not in rhythm with my own. Again, I stop. Only that time I spin around on the spot, shining my flashlight into the darkness. I didn't see anything, and the sound of footsteps didn't continue, but I started to get this horrible feeling that there was something just out of range of my flashlight. That then queued up all these questions like, who's down here without a flashlight, and who might follow me and not announce themselves? The Cincinnati PD had been known to patrol the tunnels and kick out any homeless trying to sleep there, and the Urbex crowd tend to hate cops and security guards, but I found myself in this weird position where I actually hoped it was a cop that was following me, and not someone else. I tried to just push on, but turning around every so often when I thought I heard footsteps began to slow me down. And then I began to hit other obstacles. Those same cubes of concrete I'd seen previously, only they were much larger. Some of them were so big I had to actually step up onto them to get past. It made no sense why they were there either, like they only seemed to serve the purpose of constructing the tunnel. After another few hundred yards, the beam of my flashlight began to illuminate something that just sent my stomach into knots. For absolutely no reason I could discern, the tunnel abruptly narrowed to the point that there was only a very small vertical gap that I'd have to push myself a couple of feet through to keep going. I actually just stood there for a second and said out loud, "You have to be kidding me." The only other thing was the worry that the gap would somehow narrow even further, and that I might get stuck trying to get through. But right as I'm mulling that thought over, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. Only that time, there was no mistaking it. It couldn't have been the echo of my own. There was definitely someone else in that tunnel with me. I called out to them. Wishful thinking, I suppose, and when the speed of the footsteps dramatically increased, I knew their intentions toward me were not good. fight or flight kicked in, and in the moment, I chose flight, shoving myself shoulder first into the narrow opening in the concrete before grinding my way through. The whole time I expected to feel a hand grabbing at my back, and when I finally popped out of the other side, I spun around and shone my flashlight to see who in God's name was chasing me. But there was no one. I knew they were there, though, hiding off just to the side, maybe just waiting for me to let my guard down before pushing through after me. Needless to say, I didn't wait to find out if I was right. I just took off along the wet concrete, trying to put as much distance between myself and my pursuer as possible. As I ran, I started to notice a lot more of those weird cuboid structures, only this time some of them were triangular, like little pyramids coming out of the walls, floor, and ceiling. The others had at least looked like they served some kind of purpose, but these new things looked almost completely random, like they were a glitch in a video game's levels or something. I'd have taken more time to observe them if I hadn't been running for my life. Only after a few hundred yards or so, the tunnel narrowed off yet again. Only that time, it was like nothing I'd ever seen in my entire life. Now that I think back on it, it was like looking at a piece of tessellated art, like the kind that uses different sizes of the same shape to create a kind of 3D optical illusion. It would have been fascinating if I hadn't been forced to crawl through it on my stomach, not knowing if I was going to get trapped and starve to death in there. The whole lining of the passageway was ridged with tiny versions of the same pyramid structures, and it was so narrow that I had to take off my backpack and shove it in front of me in order to fit through. The little ridges raked at my back the whole way, but my adrenaline was pumping so hard that I could feel the damage it was doing. It just didn't hurt. And then came the moment where I couldn't advance any further. I could feel the little ridges against my skull, neck, and shoulders. I couldn't push my backpack any further, and I was actually stuck. I was so scared I felt sick, and I'm not ashamed to say I felt the overwhelming urge to burst into tears. My mom had always told me that I'd eventually get myself hurt if I persisted with the trespassing nonsense, and in that moment, it seemed like she'd been proven right. Only the thing that made me want to burst into tears was the fact that she might never find out how right she was. I'd never be found because I knew I was somewhere I wouldn't be found just by looking for it. I know that must make no sense, but in that moment, trapped in the bizarre, intricately chiseled crawl space, it made all the sense of the world. And just as it was sinking in just how screwed I really was, I heard something moving through the tunnels behind me. I'm not even sure how this really happened because as much as I tried to force my way through the crawl space, I simply could not go any further. But hearing that person and what I'm assuming was a person moving up behind me, it just sent me into overdrive. I just kept focusing on kicking my legs, wiggling my torso, and pushing my backpack in front of me that I barely even realized I'd shoved it out the other side. Then once I could get a grip of the opening, I let out all the air in my lungs to be able to fit through, and pulling with all my might. Feeling myself free of the crawl space concrete grip was the second time that night that I almost cried. But there was no time to celebrate. I had to keep moving. Only right when I needed it the most, right when I thought I was about to lose my mind with fear, my flashlight started to flicker. I'd replaced the batteries that night in preparation for exploring the subway. There was no way I could have been down there long enough to drain them. And I just lost it, consumed by panic, and I sprinted down the corridor, trying to make as much progress as possible before the flashlight gave out entirely. It started to flicker again, and I was running. I actually started calling out, "Mom, Mom," like she could somehow save me from a nightmarish fate. Then I tripped, and I hit the dirt hard. I felt the sting of the grazes on my forearms mix with my sweat, and there was this dull ringing in my ear that I first figured was from being knocked unconscious. But the monotonous ringing wasn't anything in my head. It was from a nearby highway. And when I opened my eyes, I saw I was back outside. I have absolutely no idea how I got back outside after tripping in the darkness. When I stopped ugly weeping into the dirt, I looked around for the entrance I'd fallen out of, but I couldn't see anything. Then right as I'm trying to work out what in God's name just happened to me, I feel my phone buzzing in my pocket as it reconnected to the cell network. And I won't bore you with the whole aftermath. I feel like this whole thing is just a massive wall of text already, but the looks on my friends' faces on the ride back as I tried to explain what happened, well, they put me off ever trying to properly explain it to someone. I went to therapy for a few years after a psychiatrist diagnosed me as having experienced a stress-induced psychotic break. I tried to accept that what happened was all just in my head, but honestly, I know that isn't entirely the case. And for some reason, whenever my mind wanders back to that night, I think of that giant black figure someone had spray painted on the wall. At the time, I had no idea why anyone would spend so much time on something that no one might ever see. But now, I think I understand. Being one of the most densely populated cities on the planet, Tokyo is also home to one of the busiest metro systems. One of two metro systems in the Japanese capital, the Tokyo Metro, catered to a mind-boggling 2.7 billion travelers during 2019 alone. And the network can get so busy that the metro employs what are known as oshiya, or passenger pushers, whose job is to shove and cram every last commuter into the carriages and ensure that nobody is caught in the doors. Those with an innocent or benevolent way of thinking will marvel at the sheer magnitude of such a system, but others with much more sinister inclinations see such a high concentration of people and have much more malevolent thoughts. And one of these people was Kyoto Hattori. On Halloween of 2021, at around 8 p.m. Japanese time, a group of commuters were traveling into Kokoryo Station on the Keiyo line in Chofu, one of Tokyo's western suburbs. At the previous stop, the passengers of one train car had been somewhat alarmed to see a young man boarding the train who appeared to be dressed as the Joker. He wore a dark blue suit that had just a hint of purple to it, along with a green shirt and patterned tie. It was Kyoto Hattori. Halloween is a widely celebrated holiday in Japan, especially in metropolitan areas, so while it wasn't entirely unexpected to see a person in fancy dress that evening, there was something about this particular young man that seemed to put people on edge. It was something in the way he moved, something in the way he eyed them up while the lower half of his face was concealed with a COVID mask. He sat far too comfortably next to a fellow passenger, attempting to make eye contact with them, behavior which is considered shockingly rude in Japanese public transport culture. Kyoto persisted, and when the 72-year-old man finally turned to look at him, Kyoto reached into the pocket of his dark blue jacket and pulled out a spray bottle filled with hydrochloric acid. Then all their fellow passengers could do was watch in horror as Kyoto aimed the spray bottle at his neighbor's eyes before unleashing a torrent of stinging fluid directly into his eyes. The man screamed, his hands flying up to his face in an attempt to wipe the acidic substance from his now burning eyeballs. And then while the man was blinded and defenseless, Kyoto pulled out an 11-inch long kitchen knife and plunged it into the man's chest. Some later said that they believed the whole thing to be nothing more than an elaborate Halloween prank, since the holiday is so widely regarded in the greater Tokyo area. But there was something a little too convincing about the way the man screamed, something a little too convincing about the hot blood that poured out of his chest and the smell of it that suddenly filled the air. Then, as Kyoto turned on them, a look of wild hatred in his eyes, the horrific realization hit them like a ton of bricks. This wasn't a prank. It was real. Panic ensued. People screamed, people ran, all desperate to get away from the manic in the bizarre costume. Yet Kyoto had a plan for those who tried to flee. He reached into his jacket pocket to pull out 2 more items, a cigarette lighter, and a bottle of flammable liquid. He knew it was highly unlikely that he'd be able to catch and kill everyone in the train, so Kyoto racked his brain for a way to kill as many people as possible that was both portable and economic. And that's probably when he remembered the Daegu subway fire of 2003. While remaining relatively unknown in the West, the Daegu subway fire is widely regarded as one of the greatest civilian tragedies in contemporary Asian history. Shortly before 10 a.m. on February 18th of 2003, 56-year-old unemployed former taxi driver Kim Dae-han attempted to take his own life by self-immolation aboard the subway train he was traveling on as it pulled into Jungang-no Station in downtown Daegu, South Korea. The ensuing fire killed just short of 200 people and hospitalized over 150 others. The fire spread so fast that it engulfed 2 whole passengers' trains in just over 4 minutes, and remains the single deadliest loss of civilian life in South Korean history. The rebuilt Jungang-no Station features a museum and memorial which commemorates the fire, and the tragedy made headline all over the surrounding region. Given that the 24-year-old Kyoto would have been around 5 years old at the time of the fire, there's a good chance he either remembered it or read about it later on in life while tumbling down some morbid Wikipedia rabbit hole. Either way, the fact that Kyoto had thought to bring a means of starting a fire shows he wanted to kill hundreds of his fellow passengers, not just the handful he would have gotten with a knife and his homemade pepper spray. So now, instead of facing down a bloodthirsty cosplayer with a blade and a spray bottle full of acid, commuters were now up against something they might not be able to combat: a raging inferno and the choking smoke it would birth. Thankfully, the Tokyo metro system has some marvelously advanced safety mechanisms built into it, and as the now burning train passed through Fuda Station, one of the passengers pressed the emergency alarm. In response, the train planned to make an automated emergency stop at the upcoming Kokyuryo station. Then, while the train was approaching it, another passenger yanked on the emergency door release handle, causing the train to stop around 2 to 3 meters before its proper parking position. As the train was coming to a stop, footage recorded by a passenger showed other passengers fleeing to one end of the train as the fire ignited by the attacker erupted in one of the cars. After the train had come to a stop, passengers opened the train's windows and climbed out to escape. Their quick actions prevented what could have been a huge loss of life. But in the course of this rampage, Kyoto managed to stab 17 people before the train finally emptied out, with the man with the chest wound having been rushed to the hospital. However, either via an automatic sprinkler system or the efforts of first responders, the fire on the affected train car was extinguished before it could do any serious damages. Yet instead of attacking more passengers or attempting to flee the scene, Kyoto Hattori simply sat down on one of the train's seats, took out a pack of cigarettes, and sparked one up. There's even a video of this moment circulating online, one in which Kyoto puffs away on the cigarette as if he experienced some kind of post-coital satisfaction while glaring into the camera. After being arrested, Kyoto Hattori allegedly told investigating police officers that, much like his Korean arsonist counterpart, his plan had been an elaborate method of taking his own life. He cited employment trouble and fallouts with friends as causing him to spiral into a deep depression. But when he decided to end his own life, he found he didn't have the capacity to go through with it. That's when he discovered that according to Japanese law, he would receive the death penalty if he murdered at least 2 of his fellow citizens. He couldn't hurt himself, but in the pursuit of his own death, he knew he could summon the will to kill others. It was a horrific attack on a group of innocent, defenseless train passengers whose only crime was to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. In the aftermath, many commenters discuss Kyoto's choice of the Joker costume, with some warning that the recent Joaquin Phoenix portrayal had become a beacon for angry, violent young men who seek to unleash their own torment on the world around them. Kyoto's case has yet to go to trial, although it's clear that he won't have his death wish fulfilled, as thankfully, all those wounded that day would go on to make full recoveries, even the 72-year-old stab victim who suffered a punctured lung during the attack. It's most likely that Kyoto will be condemned to prison, where for a long, long time, he'll be faced with the irrefutable futility and cruelty of his actions. Since mid-July of 2021, China's Henan province had been affected by a prolonged period of heavy rainfall. In just 1 hour alone, weather stations in the provincial capital of Zhengzhou observed a maximum rainfall of 20 centimeters, and that might not sound like too much, but consider the fact that just 20 centimeters caused a horrifying 302 deaths. The flooding has affected a whopping 9.3 million people, and with over 800,000 of them requiring emergency evacuation. Naturally, there are hundreds of thousands of tragic and terrifying stories that have come out of Henan in the past few months, but arguably none quite as horrifying as those that emerged from the floods of July 20th. Zhengzhou is located in a semi-arid region far from China's coasts, a place where the annual rainfall averages just 60 centimeters. But on July 20th alone, 67 centimeters of rain was dumped on the city's unsuspecting populace, with the water pooling in low-lying areas and flooding many of the city's streets. Zhengzhou University's chief hydrologist Hu Kaihang stated the city's drainage system was built to withstand what's known as a 100-year flood, so named so because they only occurred every 100 years. Zhengzhou's metro system, on the other hand, its subterranean location making it very susceptible to the flooding, was built to withstand a 200-year flood, with its entrances built on raised platforms to negate the effects of the heavy summer rains. Yet Hu later stated that the Zhengzhou that day was more like a 1,000-year flood, and unbeknownst to the subway system's operators, water had begun to collect in a metro yard in a low-lying area of the city. Around 6 p.m. that evening, commuters traveling to the Zhengzhou subway system were well aware of the heavy rain that had been falling, but had already been assured that the system was essentially flood-proof. Yet when all the system's trains suddenly ground to a halt, most of which did so in the network of tunnels, its passengers began to suspect that the system wasn't as flood-proof as they'd been told. Some believed it was simply a temporary fault on the line, and that the trains would resume service in due course. But after an extended period of time went by, the passengers began to grow concerned. By 6:10 p.m., just over 500 passengers were trapped underground, 500 passengers who noticed that water had begun to pool on the tracks outside their windows. They must have known that the suspension of service was connected to some kind of leak, but none could have expected how dire the situation was about to get, or the horror that would unfold as a result. Slowly but surely, over the course of the next hour or so, the water levels outside the subway trains grew higher and higher. Cell phone videos of the incident illustrate the elevating levels of concern as anxious humming grows into a crescendo of terrified cries when the waterline reaches the windows of the train's sliding doors. By that point, water had begun to leak into the train carriages themselves, and terrified passengers found themselves having to stand on the seats in order to avoid the still rising waters. By the point that it became too hard to breathe in the train carriages, the passengers knew they had to fight for their lives, and they began to break out of the trains and swim for safety. Many described the terror that they felt as they swam harder and faster than ever before, dreading the moment the water line slipped over their heads and only a lungful of oxygen would separate them from a painful death by drowning. We can only imagine their relief as they emerged at the metro system's various stations, wading their way through waist and chest-high waters as the sheer scale of the disaster became evident to them. Elsewhere in the central Chinese city, almost 100 children had to be rescued from a flooded nursery school, with Chinese state media airing footage of them being floated out in plastic tubs given to them by rescue workers. The first affiliated hospital of Zhengzhou also briefly lost power at one point, which naturally made dealing with the flood casualties extremely difficult. However, Chinese authorities were quick to add that power was restored to the hospital within just a few hours, and that the blackout didn't contribute to any of the deaths that day. The floods were such a catastrophe that an entire battalion of the Chinese People's Liberation Army was mobilized after a 20-meter breach emerged in the Luoyang City Dam. PLA High Command was apparently told that the dam could collapse at any time, and if it had, it's estimated that the breach would cause tens of thousands of flood-related deaths. Thankfully, the dam held, but for a while, Chinese social media was aflame with horrifying statuses posted by terrified flood victims. "We don't know how to swim. The whole village is about to be washed away," one person wrote, as the ruination of entire families was documented, each in less than 140 characters. Out of the 500 passengers that were trapped underground that evening, it seems a miracle that only 12 people lost their lives. But those are 12 poor souls who still should be with us today. And although we can argue back and forth on the cause of such dramatic rainfall, questions must be asked when the integrity of a city's public transport system fails so spectacularly and with such fatal results. We can only hope that the lessons of the Zhengzhou subway floods will be learned, and in 1,000 years, when the next apocalyptic rainstorm comes around, we'll be much more prepared to deal with it. On the evening of May 16, 1937, a woman named Laetitia Taureau headed for a bus stop after leaving a dance hall in a Parisian suburb. The 29-year-old cut a striking figure as she boarded in a green suit, white hat, and gloves, and exactly 24 minutes later, she arrived at a metro station, the Porte de Charenton, and boarded the first-class car bound for central Paris. While the other cars are full, the first class was empty aside from Laetitia, allowing her a sense of comfort and privacy as she traveled. But she was wrong to feel comfortable, as the malevolent will of another was about to take away her most precious possession. Laetitia's train departed the Porte de Charenton station at exactly 6:26 p.m., and just 45 seconds later arrived at another station, the Porte d'Auray. 6 passengers entered the first-class car, also bound for central Paris. But as they did so, they discovered a horrifying scene. Laetitia Taureau had been murdered, and the 9-inch dagger that her killer had used to take her life was still lodged in the flesh of her neck. No one had exited, and no one else had been in the car. So who on earth had killed her and managed to escape in less than 60 seconds? Within just a few days of her murder, the Parisian police had uncovered a few pieces of strange information regarding Laetitia's life. She held a job in a glue factory by day, but by night, Laetitia was said to frequent dance halls, or bal musette, as they are known among the locals. Some viewed Laetitia as a naive, innocent victim, but most saw her as a heartless social climber, a girl who married her late husband without his family's knowledge or consent, having expertly manipulated him into writing her into his last will and testament. In addition, though she was apparently faithful to him during their marriage, after his death she had numerous affairs, and many suspected these had been subtly maintained during her marriage. She also, strangely, was known by some acquaintances as Yolanda, something the police found very curious indeed. Why a woman would need a second identity like that? The answer is perhaps even more sinister than you might suspect. To their amazement, Parisian detectives discovered that Laetitia was also a paid confidential informant for a Parisian detective agency known as La Agency Ruf. Bal musette were known to attract pimps, escorts, and drug dealers, so it became evident that Laetitia's presence there constituted more than just recreation. She could have angered the wrong cartel, betrayed the wrong gangster, and the injured party could have sought retribution and blood. However, some more conspiratorially minded people believed she had been killed by the French fascist terrorist group called La Cagoule. When the French police launched a midnight raid against La Cagoule on November 15, 1937, several members claimed to know something about Letitia Thoreau's murder. They stated that she had been a spy hidden among their ranks, and after she was identified, they had enacted a scheme to track her down and kill her, with her assassin managing to catch her alone while she was boarding the train at Port de Charenton. However, despite their apparent confession, the group's leaders were never convinced of Letitia's murder. In fact, the investigating detective failed to convict anyone of her murder, instead only offering the most logical explanation. It appears that sometime in 1936, Letitia, now known as Yolanda and working for the police to infiltrate illegal political groups, became the lover of Gente, the Kegel's arms smuggling expert. Gente ran a garage near Montmartre and commanded a fleet of cars he used to smuggle arms from Geneva to Paris. By the spring of 1937, the Kegel began to suspect Thoreau of deceit and set a trap for her. News of an upcoming arms run was leaked to her, but then the car was stopped at the Swiss border, and it was empty. The ruse cost Thoreau her life. It's entirely possible that Letitia's involvement in the espionage of pre-World War II Europe was to blame for her demise. Yet it's also grimly feasible that she was snuffed out by a man who took an opportunity when he saw her alone, and ended up taking her life, too. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. EST. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, it was all ooze bats.